Welcome back to another explainer. We love taking these massive, complex global issues and really breaking them down so you can see the hidden mechanics at work. And today we're looking at a huge, literal game changer happening right now in global climate policy. So, for decades, the entire world's approach to reducing emissions has basically been dominated by one big idea: carbon markets. But lately, researchers have been pointing out some pretty deep systemic flaws in that model. And that's leading to the rise of a completely different framework, one that actually ties emissions directly to socioeconomic inequality. Okay, let's dive into this. We're going to break this whole thing down into 5 highly manageable chapters for you. 1. The carbon market paradox. 2. How carbon markets work. 3. Contradictions of carbon pricing. 4. How inequality fuels emissions. And finally, 5. The Green New Deal. Let's kick things off with Chapter 1, the carbon market paradox.
So researchers point to what they call a paradox in Paris. Basically, global climate policy reflects this incredibly strong commitment to market-based approaches, specifically carbon markets. The original idea, right, was that if you just slap a price tag on pollution, the free market will naturally find the absolute most cost-effective way to reduce greenhouse gases. It makes sense on paper, but here's the paradox. This profound global reliance on carbon markets is persisting, even as the existing trading schemes have faced some really severe historical crises and honestly have struggled to drive the kind of transformational change we actually need. And the scale of these crises? It's pretty staggering. Get this. Between 2011 and 2015, the trading value of global carbon markets collapsed by 80%. 80%! In the European Union's emissions trading system, allowance prices dropped under 10 euros. That is way below what advocates were saying was necessary to actually meet that famous Paris target of 1.5 degrees Celsius. Meanwhile, UN carbon offset prices basically fell off a cliff, plummeting to less than a single euro. Naturally, financial institutions started losing interest fast. And it's this stark economic reality that really prompted researchers to start heavily questioning this whole carbon-centric model.
Moving right along to Chapter 2, how carbon markets work.
So before we go deeper, let's make sure we actually understand the mechanics here. The most prominent system out there is called cap and trade, which is famously used by the European Union. Here's how it works in a nutshell. Governments set a maximum limit, a cap, on total emissions for certain sectors. Then they distribute or auction off these allowances, which are essentially just permits to pollute, to thousands of power plants and factories. Now, if a factory manages to emit less than its cap, it can actually trade and sell those leftover allowances to another factory that went over its limit. Theoretically, this lets the market do its thing and find the absolute cheapest possible way to reduce overall emissions. Now, the other major model you'll hear about is called baseline and credit. Think of the UN's Clean Development Mechanism for this one. Instead of capping total emissions across the board, this model allows developed countries to fund individual green projects, like, say, building a brand new wind farm in a developing nation. And they use that to offset their own domestic pollution back home. The step-by-step logic here is pretty simple, even if the economics are dense. First, you establish a baseline of what emissions would have been without your project. Second, you actually implement the project. Maybe you're installing energy-efficient lighting across a whole city. Third, you assess the difference between that original baseline and your actual new emissions. Fourth, you're awarded carbon credits equal to that exact reduction. And finally, step 5, you sell those credits to governments or major corporations so they can comply with their own climate targets. Like I said, it's a very elegant theoretical process. But, as we all know, elegant theory doesn't always translate perfectly to messy reality. Let's move to and see how this builds into Chapter 3, Contradictions of Carbon Pricing. Researchers have identified a really fascinating rule of 3 when it comes to the contradictions of carbon markets. First, carbon markets treat what is a deeply unequal socio-ecological problem with strict formal market equality. Basically, that means a minor, cheap emissions reduction is treated exactly the same on paper as a major, transformative one. Second, and this is highly ironic, the entire economic viability of carbon markets literally relies on maintaining the very fossil fuel industries they're supposed to be phasing out. Think about it. Without polluters, those carbon allowances have absolutely zero value. And third, this system prioritizes efficient pricing above all else, which often ends up crowding out much broader, multi-pronged policy debates. To make that first contradiction really concrete for you, let's look at fuel switching. In the first phase of the EU market, the vast majority of emissions reductions came simply from power plants switching from burning coal to burning natural gas. Why?
Well, because the market incentive is always to find the cheapest, fastest fix. Switching to gas is cheap, and it reduces emissions just enough to comply. But here is the catch. It completely fails to drive the deep, expensive, systemic investments we absolutely need for a true transition to zero carbon. It's just working within the existing fossil fuel framework instead of actually transforming it.
Which brings us to a massive blind spot. Chapter 4, How Inequality Fuels Emissions. Right now, we are witnessing a major clash between two different academic and policy paradigms. On one side, you have the carbon-centric paradigm. This treats climate change strictly as a technical problem of greenhouse gases, and the goal is just to reduce them efficiently through carbon pricing. But on the other side, you have the emerging Green New Deal paradigm. This one argues you simply cannot separate carbon from society. It views excessive emissions as being so densely intertwined with socioeconomic inequality that you cannot successfully fix the climate without simultaneous systemic economic reform. To back this up, researchers map out 5 distinct mechanisms where wealth disparity directly fuels the climate crisis. We can call this the rule of 5. We've got consumption, production, obstruction, trepidation, and non-cooperation. By understanding these specific behaviors, we can see exactly how a divided society inherently creates a warmer planet. Let's start with consumption. The sheer scale of the disparity here is shocking, and this brilliantly illustrates the point. The top 10% of the global income distribution is responsible for 49% of global CO2 emissions, nearly half. As incomes rise, consumption and energy use just skyrocket. So attempting to lower global emissions without addressing the highly concentrated wealth right at the top of the distribution, it's mathematically incredibly difficult. But look, it's not just about wealthy individuals buying luxury goods, flying private jets, or driving massive cars. The second and third mechanisms, production and obstruction, are deeply tied to capital ownership. The wealthy control the vast majority of the means of production globally, and because they're driven by the need for short-term shareholder profits, they often dictate high-carbon production decisions. On top of that, they can use this concentrated wealth to politically obstruct any climate regulations that might threaten those profits. So basically, concentrated wealth equals concentrated emissions and concentrated political resistance. Then we have the fourth mechanism, which is trepidation. See, when policymakers ignore inequality and simply slap a price on carbon, that policy often acts regressively. It ends up raising the everyday cost of basic necessities, like heating a home or fueling a car, for low-income households who are already struggling to get by. This leads to intense economic trepidation and ultimately massive political backlash. Working-class communities often end up rejecting climate policies entirely because, for them, it quite literally threatens their immediate financial survival. And that brings us to Chapter 5, the Green New Deal. Now, we're looking at this impartially today, not as a political slogan, but as a deeply researched, holistic policy alternative designed to tackle both of these crises at the exact same time. The Green New Deal paradigm rests on specific policy pillars that are quite literally designed to neutralize those 5 mechanisms of inequality we just talked about. First, you have sustainable social provisioning. This means ensuring everyone has access to low-carbon necessities, things like gas-free public housing and active transport, without eroding their purchasing power. Second, financial security guarantees, like job training and enhanced social safety nets. This effectively removes that trepidation factor for the working class. And third, reconfiguring power dynamics to limit the outsized influence of fossil fuel capital. The logic here is that by securing people's economic survival first, you actually equip society to embrace rapid decarbonization without fear. So, the crucial point is this. Climate policy is shifting right now because our very understanding of the problem is shifting. You just cannot price your way out of a problem that is deeply rooted in how our society produces, consumes, and distributes power. When we look at how these paradigms overlap, it leaves us with one incredibly provocative question. Can we truly solve the climate crisis without fixing the economic system that created it in the first place? Thanks so much for joining us for this explainer. We'll see you on the next one.